He ran into the fire, not away from it. That's the kind of man Mark Coleman is. After rescuing his loved ones from a burning house, Mark Coleman collapsed and slipped into a coma. The world prayed. Fans remembered his fights. Family stood in silence. But no one expected what the nurses and staff would find in his hospital room after he woke up. It wasn't just a man lying in bed. It was a lifetime of battles, a quiet symbol of who he really was. And what they found next shattered everyone who saw it. Before he was a headline for survival, Mark Coleman was the embodiment of raw power and unrelenting dominance. They didn't call him the Hammer because it sounded cool. They called him that because every time he entered a cage, it felt like a hammer was being swung at full force, relentless, crushing, final. He was the first UFC heavyweight champion for a reason, and that reason was fear. Long before MMA became a billion-dollar sport, before Octagon lighting and mega arenas, there was Coleman, a former NCAA wrestling champion, an Olympic wrestler, a blue-collar Ohio native with a neck like a tree trunk and the mindset of a freight train. He wasn't trying to outpoint his opponents. He wasn't trying to be flashy. He was trying to dominate, and for a time, no one could stop him. When he made his UFC debut in 1996, the crowd barely knew what to expect. What they got was a one-sided display of wrestling savagery. Coleman smashed through the competition. Fighters had no answers for his ground and pound, a term that, at the time, was still being coined. He would take opponents down, trap their limbs, and rain fists until they couldn't move. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polished, but it worked. He won the UFC 10 and UFC 11 tournaments back-to-back. And when the UFC introduced the heavyweight title, Mark Coleman became the first man to wear it. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. In 2000, Coleman transitioned to Japan's PRIDE Fighting Championships, an organization that thrived on spectacle and danger. There, he fought the likes of Igor Vovchanchin, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, and Fedor Emelianenko, some of the greatest fighters to ever live. He wasn't just competing anymore. He was aging, hurting, taking more damage than ever before, but he never walked away. His Pride Grand Prix 2000 win was a shining moment, but behind the scenes, things were cracking. Years of combat had begun to show on his body. The surgeries piled up. His joints betrayed him. But in public, Coleman still smiled, still flexed, still fought. What no one saw, or maybe refused to see, was the damage accumulating behind that iron jaw and sculpted frame. He was a man breaking down, but still answering the bell. That was the code. That was the culture. The pain was getting louder. But Mark Coleman, he never complained. And that silence would soon speak volumes in a hospital room no one expected. After the cameras stopped rolling and the spotlight faded, Mark Coleman entered a battle that too many fighters know intimately and few ever speak about. It wasn't about knockouts anymore. It was about staying alive, about enduring the hidden war that begins once the gloves come off. Retirement from fighting didn't bring peace. It brought pain. Coleman had racked up injuries that would cripple most men. His knees were torn up, his spine damaged, his brain undoubtedly bruised after years of taking blows. And then came the pills, the prescriptions, the slow descent that happens when a man who once felt invincible starts to feel irrelevant. There were interviews in those years, quiet ones, late-night podcasts and fan conventions where Coleman would talk about the good old days. But between the lines, there was something heavier, regret, maybe, exhaustion, definitely. He wasn't hiding it, but he wasn't broadcasting it either. At one point, Coleman admitted publicly that he had battled alcohol addiction and dependence on painkillers. He said he was trying to be better, trying to get clean. But behind that was the story of a man caught in the current of everything he once ran from. Weakness, vulnerability, fear. He stayed connected to the MMA world, appeared at UFC events, watched his daughters grow up. But there were days when he was completely alone, when the crowds were gone, and the only thing echoing in his mind was the roar of an arena from 20 years ago. Friends worried. You could see it in the way other fighters spoke about him. They respected him, revered him, but they knew something was wrong. His words were slower, his walk was stiff. His once mountainous frame had withered slightly, almost like his past was still feeding off of him. And yet he remained a fighter, not in the cage, but in life. He trained when he could. He spoke to young athletes about the dangers of post-career pain. He tried to be a mentor, even if he himself still hadn't healed. Then came the night of the fire. A house in Ohio, smoke, panic, and instinct. And in that one moment, every fight, every scar, every ounce of pain meant something. Because Mark Coleman, broken body and all, did the unthinkable. He ran toward the flames. It happened in March 2024. The details, at first, were scattered. Just headlines, social media posts, hushed reports about a house fire somewhere in Ohio. But when the full story emerged, the world stood still. Mark Coleman had been home with his family when the fire broke out. It was fast, relentless, the kind of blaze that eats a house whole in minutes. There was shouting, smoke, chaos. His daughters were trapped, and without a second thought, Coleman, age 59, with a spine held together by years of surgery, charged back into the inferno. He pulled them out one by one. No cameras, no crowd, just instinct. A fighter's instinct, not for points, not for pride, for love, for survival. When the last of them was safe, Coleman collapsed outside the home, barely breathing. His lungs had been scorched by the smoke. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, and shortly after, he slipped into a coma. The headlines changed. UFC legend hospitalized after saving family from fire. And then, Mark Coleman in critical condition. Family asks for prayers. Social media lit up. Fighters posted tributes. Dana White called him a hero. Former rivals shared stories of his toughness. But underneath it all was one terrifying truth. Mark Coleman might not wake up. He had already fought countless battles in the ring. But now, this was the fight of his life. In a hospital room filled with wires, monitors, and silent tears, he lay motionless. Every breath assisted, every moment uncertain. Outside, fans left flowers. Family members clung to hope. Former UFC champions called to check in. For the first time in years, the spotlight returned to Coleman, but not for violence, for valor. And while everyone waited, something quietly sat beside his bed. Something no one had expected. A small object, simple, but powerful enough to make even the nurses cry. And what they found inside broke everyone's heart. The hospital room was silent. Machines beeped softly. Tubes snaked around Mark Coleman's body, like lifelines trying to hold him here just a little longer. The man who once marched through arenas with blood on his gloves and fire in his eyes now lay completely still. No spotlight, no bell, just the fight to stay alive. The coma had set in quickly. Smoke inhalation had ravaged his lungs. Doctors placed him under to help his body recover, but they made no promises. Every hour was a coin flip. Some days, his vital signs stabilized. Others, they dropped. His daughters sat by his side, holding a hand that once crushed legends. They whispered to him, told him he was strong, that he had already won the hardest fight, but Mark couldn't answer. News of his condition spread across the MMA world like wildfire. Fighters from every era began posting tributes. "Come on, Hammer," wrote Randy Couture. "You've got more fight in you." Bas Rutten posted a video, visibly emotional, calling Coleman the definition of warrior. Even Dana White went live, pausing mid-sentence while describing Coleman's bravery. You don't see that kind of selflessness, not just in this sport, in life, but outside the public eye, behind the doors of that quiet hospital room, something more powerful was unfolding. Nurses and staff began to notice something unusual. Each shift change, the same items remained untouched by Coleman's bedside. Not medical equipment, not flowers. Something personal, something handwritten. Tucked beside his hospital bed was a small, battered notebook, spiral-bound, the cover bent, the edges singed, likely grabbed in the chaos of the fire. At first, no one paid much attention. It looked like an old journal or maybe a to-do list. But when a nurse finally opened it, what she found inside caused her to pause, then quietly leave the room in tears. Because this wasn't just a notebook. It was a window into Mark Coleman's soul. It contained letter after letter, each scrawled in rough handwriting. Some were notes to his daughters, filled with love, apologies, and proud words of encouragement. Others were addressed to God, pleas for strength, forgiveness, and peace. One note simply read, "If I don't don't wake up. Tell them I never stopped loving them. No one expected to find this. Not next to a man who was built like a machine, not next to the UFC's first heavyweight champion, but there it was. Proof that behind every warrior is a father, a friend, a man still fighting for something. And this notebook was only the beginning. When the nurse handed the notebook to Coleman's daughters, they didn't say a word at first. They sat down in the cold hospital chair, opened the first page, and read the shaky handwriting they knew all too well. Their father, known to millions as the Hammer, had poured pieces of himself into those pages. Not stories of fights, not records or victories, but raw, unfiltered emotion, the kind he never showed in front of cameras. The letters varied in tone. Some were full of hope. If I come out of this, I swear I'll be better. I'll be more present. I'll be the dad you deserve. Others carried the haunting tone of a man preparing to die. If this is it, I just want you to know I'm not scared. I'm proud of you. Don't be sad. Smile big. That's what I want to see. The most heart-wrenching entry was a drawing, a crude sketch of a family, him, his daughters, his dog. Underneath it, he had written, "This is what I fought for. This is what I'd burn for." That image was later shared on social media, and within hours, it went viral. Not because it was beautifully drawn, but because it captured what fans had long suspected but never truly seen. Mark Coleman wasn't just a fighter. He was a protector, a provider, and he had always known the cost of his career. But the notebook wasn't the only thing in that room. One nurse mentioned a small shoebox under his bedside table. Inside it were fragments of his past. An old pair of UFC gloves, cracked, faded, still wrapped in white hand tape. A faded photograph of his daughters from years ago, taped to a folded prayer card from his mother's funeral. And tucked at the bottom, a laminated letter from a fan, dated 2003, thanking him for inspiring them to get clean. He had kept it for over 20 years. These weren't trophies. They were reminders. Reminders of who he had been and who he still wanted to be. Even while unconscious, even as his body shut down, Mark Coleman's room was alive with meaning. It was a museum of a man who had always lived with his heart on the line, even if most people only saw the fists. And as the world watched and waited, one final discovery would remind everyone just how deep that heart truly ran. In the corner of the hospital room, near the window where light occasionally filtered through, sat an envelope. It had no label, just a single word, written in shaky penmanship: legacy. At first, staff assumed it was something routine, medical instructions, or perhaps an insurance form. But when his daughter finally opened it, she gasped. Inside were pages of handwritten reflections, his thoughts on what legacy meant, what he regretted, what he hoped people would remember. "They'll say I was tough, maybe the toughest, but I hope they say I was kind. I fought for money once, then for pride. Now I fight for peace. Don't remember the wins. Remember that I kept going." These words weren't written for the public. They weren't meant for ESPN soundbites or UFC Hall of Fame speeches. They were written for his family, for the nurses who kept him alive, for anyone who might ever wonder what it was like to be Mark Coleman. Not the myth, but the man. And beside that envelope, there was one final item that broke everyone in the room. It was a children's drawing, crayon on cheap paper, a rainbow, a stick figure with a big arm labeled DAD. It was drawn years ago by one of his daughters, back when Coleman was still in Pride, still fighting giants in Japan. Somehow, it had made it through the fire. It had been inside his wallet. The edges were charred, but the figure was still there, smiling. That's what they found. A notebook full of love, a shoebox of memories, an envelope of wisdom, a drawing that refused to burn. And in that room, full of machines and wires and silence, every item told the same story, that Mark Coleman never stopped fighting, not for fame, not for belts, but for the people he loved. And now, as the world held its breath, that same love was fighting to bring him back. The doctors had told his family to prepare for the worst. The coma had lasted longer than expected. His lungs were weak. Brain function was being monitored closely. Every day, his daughters sat in silence by his side, reading his letters aloud, hoping he could hear them. Nurses whispered that even though he wasn't moving, he sometimes teared up just a little when his daughters held his hand. And then, the miracle. One morning, a nurse stepped in to check his vitals and noticed movement. Coleman's hand twitched. His chest rose more steadily. His eyelids fluttered. It wasn't much, but it was something, a spark, a sign that the warrior still had one more comeback left in him. Later that day, he opened his eyes. At first, he was disoriented. The lights, the machine, the pain. He couldn't speak clearly, but he mouthed words. The nurse leaned in, trying to understand, and then he whispered something that made her eyes well with tears. "Did I save them?" It was the first thing he asked, not about himself, not about his injuries, but about his daughters. Even after surviving a fire, nearly dying, and waking from a coma, his first concern was whether or not he had succeeded in protecting his family. His daughters rushed in. They held his hands, sobbing. Coleman was weak, barely able to lift his arm, but he managed to squeeze their fingers. He looked at them and smiled through cracked lips, saying softly, "I'd do it again." That moment shattered everyone in the room. The man who had once ruled the cage with brute force had now revealed his greatest strength, his heart, not in the form of a knockout punch or a submission hold, but in love, sacrifice, and selflessness. Doctors called it a miraculous recovery. His lungs had sustained heavy damage, but he was stable. His mind was sharp. He was aware, and he was ready to fight again. Not in the Octagon, but in the hardest battle of all, recovery. What they didn't know yet was just how long and painful that road would be, or how the world would rally around him as he began to walk it, because Mark Coleman was awake. But the fight was far from over. The world watched with bated breath as the first videos surfaced. Mark Coleman, awake, propped up in a hospital bed. He looked frail, thinner than fans remembered, his face pale and voice raspy. But he smiled. He gave a thumbs up. And most importantly, he spoke. "I'm alive. I'm grateful. I love you all." It wasn't the voice of a champion returning to boast. It was the voice of a man reborn, humble, grateful. A man who had stared death in the face and somehow walked away. Physical therapy began almost immediately. Doctors warned it would be slow. His lungs had taken in too much smoke. He would need breathing assistance, speech training, and muscle rehabilitation. But Coleman didn't flinch. He said yes to it all. He struggled to sit up. Every movement came with pain, but he pushed, just like he did in the cage. He approached rehab with the same ferocity that once helped him slam opponents to the mat. His daughters stood by him, cheering him on. Friends visited, fellow fighters called in. Videos poured in from fans around the world, some thanking him for inspiring them, others simply saying, "You've still got it, Hammer." The MMA community raised thousands for his medical expenses. A GoFundMe campaign exceeded expectations, and more importantly, the emotional support was overwhelming. For the first time in years, Mark Coleman wasn't just remembered, he was celebrated. He began sharing updates, little by little, short videos, heartfelt messages. In one, he held up the crayon drawing from his wallet, the one that had somehow survived the fire, and said, "This is why I came back, for them." In another, he read a note from his notebook aloud. His voice broke mid-sentence. He paused, wiped a tear, and then said, "You don't need to be in a cage to be a fighter." The words resonated far beyond the MMA world. Veterans, first responders, parents, people from every walk of life began reaching out. Because what Coleman represented now wasn't just toughness. It was resilience. It was love. It was survival. And as the weeks went on, one thing became clear. The Hammer never stopped fighting. He just changed what he was fighting for. Today, Mark Coleman walks with a cane. He moves slowly, carefully. The man who once sprinted across the cage now measures every step, but he walks with purpose, with pride, and with something most men never find until the end: peace. He still bears the scars, physically and emotionally. The fire didn't just burn his lungs, it exposed everything that had been buried beneath the legend for decades. The guilt of past mistakes, the loneliness of fame, the silent pain of being forgotten. But now, people see him, truly see him. He makes public appearances again at fight events, charity functions, and rehab centers, not to brag, but to speak, to teach, to warn. He tells young fighters, "You're more than your record, more than your last fight. Don't forget who you are when the lights go off." He's also become a symbol for something the sport rarely talks about. What happens when the cheering stops? What happens when the belt is gone? When the body breaks? When the fighter becomes the man again? And that's where his legacy now lives. Not in a win column, not in a title belt, but in a notebook, in a shoebox, in the hearts of two daughters, in a hospital room where the world remembered what a real hero looks like. Mark Coleman will always be the UFC's first heavyweight champion. That will never change. But now, he's something even bigger. He's proof that toughness isn't measured in punches thrown. It's measured in lives saved, in tears shed, in the decision to live even when it hurts. What they found in his hospital room wasn't just heartbreaking, it was inspiring. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a fighter can do is survive.